Before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to say hi. This episode is a little bit longer than usual if you haven't already noticed, but I promise you it's worth every minute of your time. I did consider splitting it into two, but when I looked at my scheduling, I decided to just put it all out there as one episode. This chat with Clarence McAllister is full of really good information and funny stories, so I hope you enjoy it. Also, make sure you head to the show notes page on the website because there's a ton of really good information on there that's related to our chat. Hello, and welcome to the Building Biology Potty, where we talk about better buildings to live and breathe in. My name is Jess Kismet, and today my guest is Clarence McAllister. Clarence is both a builder and a scientist with a Bachelor of Environmental Science with honours from the University of Wollongong, and he has been running his building company Ionic Construction for 15 years. At Ionic Construction, they specialise in loads of random and unusual jobs, in Clarence's words, and typically of a remedial nature. Clarence has a particular interest in condensation management and has worked closely with the Australian Building Codes Board and the Master Builders Association, contributing to their condensation working groups and technical committees. Clarence has also teamed up with Dr. Mark Dewsbury from the University of Tasmania to develop and deliver training courses on moisture management. And with all of that background, we have got tons to talk about. So let's get into it. Clarence, welcome to the Building Biology Potty.
Thanks, Jess Kisman. We certainly do have tons to talk about. So let's get into it, and I'll leave it in your very capable and charismatic hands.
All right. So let's start at the beginning. Just give us a bit of an overview of your career to date. How did you get to be where you are now? Start at the start.
I was going to save the world as an environmental scientist many years ago, and then realised that working for the government was not my cup of tea, and then started out in the building industry 20 something years ago, and I thought it would be a good idea to blend my scientific knowledge with building knowledge and save the world again by being the king of energy efficient housing. And for one reason or another, that didn't work out the way I planned it. And here I find myself now, I suppose, in many ways on the other end of the energy efficiency side of things. And that's looking at the science behind condensation, building physics, building performance, and all the things. I suppose that the other side of energy efficiency that's not just about keeping people warm and comfortable. Because I think, in my opinion, the energy efficiency side of things is relatively easy. Keeping the building warm is relatively easy. It's all the other stuff that goes with keeping people warm that's the tremendously complicated stuff. And it's I was speaking to a colleague today, and this guy's been in the industry for 50 odd years, and gave a fascinating talk about all these projects he did, back in the 70s and 80s, and I was intrigued. And he says, "Yeah, Clarence, I'm intrigued by the stuff you do with this condensation and stuff, and it's fascinating stuff. It's never boring, never boring."
No, it really isn't. So to summarize, basically you go and fix people's stuff ups.
Look, part of it is fixing people's stuff ups, and it's interesting that people see the poor construction practice as a scourge on the industry, which it is. But in many ways, I've been able to flip that and say, well, if there is such poor practice in the industry, then there's certainly the demand there to fix that poor practice, and the amount of work I get from that is significant. But the other side of it too, and this comes back to my scientific background, particularly in biology, ecology, and so on, where experimental design is really important. And what we've got out there in the built environment is literally millions of long-term experiments going in all these houses where we can come back 20, 30, 50, 70 years later, whether we're looking at plaster, rising damp, moisture, humidity, condensation, timber deterioration, material durability, whatever it is. And we've got these ongoing experiments where if we can look at them in context, we can get this phenomenal amount of data that says we can see how buildings are behaving over these very long time spans with particular methodologies. I think that the interesting thing now is that the buildings might take 10, 15, 20 years for these problems to really sort of uh, show up in a very significant or dramatic way. And if you look at the time we've been building with radiata pine frames, MDF, engineered timbers, wrapping buildings up with blue stuff, sealing them up tight as a drum, we've really only got 15 years of that experiment, of the duration of that experiment. So maybe we haven't seen the worst of that yet. Um, and so by doing this work, it's the scientist in me comes out to say, well, let's have a look and try and put all this data together and see what we can find out, which is fascinating.
Yeah, working on all the remediation jobs that you work on, you must just be learning something new every day,
I am,
and just have
I am.
so much to say about
Yeah. No,
So I'm
that's right,
really I'm really keen.
no, and that's right. And look, just last week I was looking at a bell tower in a church in Cressy in Tasmania, and then 2 hours later I was speaking with a heritage plasterer who's specially come out from England to do the lime plastering on another heritage listed world heritage listed property at Woolmers, and so again here we've got experiments that have been going for 170 years with all this historic, and then I get to speak to people about everything from um, where you can source yew and pine logs to splitting shingles to Scottish methods of slaking lime, and on it goes. So it's fascinating stuff. And
Wow.
and and
All
and
right.
then building physics is all part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I keep saying to people, it's not building physics, it's just building. Like you have to take into account all of this stuff no matter what you're building.
Correct,
Like you
correct.
can't separate the two.
No, and building physics is everywhere. It's just
It's everywhere.
people just don't know it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And as we build the houses tighter and tighter, these issues become more and more relevant.
It's become more and
And,
more, yeah, in our
and look,
faces. Like,
and an interesting thing is this example of condensation. And people say we take a cold can out of a can of drink beer, whatever, out of the fridge and put it on the counter, and it gets condensation on it. And this is only something Mark and I came up with, Mark Dewsbury and I came up with the other day, is you get a can of drink out of the cupboard at room temperature. There is no condensation on the can that's come out at room temperature, but you get one out of the fridge, you get X amount of condensation. You bring one out of the freezer, you get a lot more. And what's happening now is we are creating that difference between internal and external environments where that difference is more and more and more significant. So where we've gone from taking the can out of the cupboard at the same temperature to taking the can out of the fridge at 5 degrees to taking the can out of the freezer at -5 degrees, and consequently that visible difference is more and more obvious.
it's a great analogy.
It is a great analogy, and this is the thing that I've been doing this for years, and we come up with better ways to explain this and help people understand it all the time, and that's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So let's get on to explaining roof ventilation, because I know this is a topic that is currently top of mind for Australian builders, particularly in the colder climate zones where it's now a requirement to ventilate the roof space in a certain way. And I
Correct.
know that you and Dr. Mark Dewsbury have been doing a lot of training recently on this exact topic. So could you please summarize it,
Yeah.
or
So
give us
look,
a bit of an explanation as to try to simplify it, please?
look, I suppose that there are many different ways we can come at it, but I'll try not to detour too much. And historically, houses in Australia, if you had a corrugated iron roof, it had 8 foot or 2.4 metre sheets of tin, which were lapped here, there, and everywhere, very uneven. A lot of air would naturally flow through the roofs. We had gable ends, we had eave overhangs, so air was naturally flowing through the roof. So only in the last 10, 15 years we've had products like um, rendered foams and more rendered brickwork, wrapping our buildings up with a lot more insulation, a lot more blue paper, etc. That we've gone away from naturally ventilated roofs to less ventilated roofs just by virtue of the building practice. So in some ways, we're really just coming back to where we were 15, 20, 25 years ago. And and I suppose there are a few really key points here, and one is that people say, oh, "How come the Building Codes Board has thrown this stuff onto us as far as roof ventilation is concerned?" This more or less is modelled on the British standard, which has been around for 20 or 30 years, BS 5250 for condensation management. This is very, very similar to the British standard for condensation management. That's the first thing. Uh, and the second really important thing is steep pitched roofs which now are nominated above 15 degrees, are naturally less prone to condensation and mold problems. So as soon as you're less than 15 or less than 10 degrees, the problems increase very, very significantly. And that is reflected in the building code in that the flatter pitched roofs, so we're talking 15 degrees or 10 degrees and under, and that is slated for change in NCC 2025 as far as having a single cutoff point, not having the intermediate sort of zone, if you like. But it will still be a case that the flatter pitch roofs require a lot more ventilation, and that just reflects the natural risk associated with flat pitch roofs as opposed to steeper pitch roofs. Now, when we do our training, and this was, I can remember the day very clearly when I was building my particular building. And I had this brainwave, and I rang up Mark and said, I've had the brainwave. Says, yeah, you've worked it out for yourself, Clarence. That's exactly correct, 100% correct. And what it is that water flows off and down steep roofs very, very easily. When you have a flatter roof, it's much harder for water to flow down a flat roof just because of gravity. And the exact opposite, or very similar to opposite, works with humidity going up. So we have warm air and air with moisture in it, which is naturally more buoyant, and it wants to flow up. If you have a steep pitch roof, it flows up very easily through a steep pitch roof. If you have a flat pitch roof, flatter pitch roof, the ability for that moist, buoyant air to warm, moist, buoyant air to flow upwards is exactly the same as water trying to flow down. It struggles to flow up underneath a flat pitch roof, and we do this. Demonstration using coffee beans and flatten the steep pitch roof, and you can just see the light bulbs going off for everybody in the room going, get it, I've got it, I totally
So
understand it now.
you roll coffee beans down a pitch and
Yes,
see what happens. Yeah.
people love coffee. Everyone, I'm not a coffee drinker, but a lot of people absolutely love their coffee. And as soon as you put coffee there you go, coffee mug in your hand. I don't drink coffee. And as soon as people get the coffee thing, and we actually use another thing with coffee to
Maybe you
understand
could use
how
M&Ms.
well M&Ms and
Although they're not round.
no, but then the training would stop there and there because I'd be eating M&Ms for the rest of the day. But anyway, um, and they know I've been doing the training course because there'll be coffee beans in the room, even no matter how hard we try to sweep them up. But I think trying to get these things explained to people in a practical way that they can visualize is really important. And that the last few times we've done this course, we did through Design Matters National a few weeks ago, is we actually have physical models of roofs and so we talk through different products, we talk through different principles, we talk through different assemblies, and having these models, I think, really helps people visualize how it all goes together and what it means, as opposed to just a drawing. And that's something Mark and I are really big on is to get these concepts into people's heads, whether that's a designer, whether that's a builder, whether that's someone out there in internet land, that they can get these principles and they stick. They have these light bulb moments, and it's I think that's as big a challenge as the sort of technical building physics side of it is getting that message to people in a way that it sticks in their head.
Yeah,
Mm, mm,
absolutely. Just
mm.
turning it into layman's terms and making it digestible for people is so important, and that's what I try and do all the time.
And it really helps. And the thing is, and we were having this bit of a conversation before, and I think there's so many parts of the building industry, and you're obviously a very good communicator, and everyone has the thing they're strongest at, which really helps, and you use those strengths to really lift everybody else up. And there's a colleague of mine, Luke Davies, and we did a video about the blower door test, and to talk about the 50 pascals thing, we had 5 kilograms of sand on a square meter of membrane and measured out the sand with a scale, poured it on the membrane, look at the deflection on the membrane over a square meter. And when you see the 50 pascals of in an actual blower door test on the interior membrane, you can see an almost identical level of deflection on that membrane as to what you can see when you pour the 5 kilograms of sand in. And that really helps people understand the principle. If you think 5 kilograms every square meter, and that's what the membrane deflection looks like in real life in the blower door test.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's a good visual. That's something
That's
I
an idea
hadn't
I got
thought of.
off Jesse Clark at the Building Physics Conference, which I think you organised 3 or 4 years ago in Sydney. So,
Yeah. Yeah, good one.
hmm,
Good one.
hmm, hmm.
Um, so just going back, is there anything you can do to help people understand the ventilation requirements? Could you go through what they actually are and what builders actually need to do?
Okay, so look, there's a table in there. Now, I'm sort of doing this off the cuff, but I'm 90% sure it's table 10.8.3 in the housing provisions of the National Construction Code. So this relates to both Class 1 buildings, which is a standalone dwelling, and also Class 2, which is an apartment, and the habitable parts of other buildings. So basically anywhere that anyone's living in any building. Well, most. There are some exceptions. Let's not go into those nursing homes, etc. But so table 10.8.3 is the key, and what it talks about is it talks about however many thousand millimeters per lineal meter. So on a lower pitch roof, it's talking about 25,000 square meters per lineal meter, which is equivalent to, you just take all the zeros off, equivalent to a 25 millimeter continuous gap. And so that's a good rule of thumb. It's not a rule of thumb, it's actually a number. 25,000 square millimeters per lineal meter equals a 25 millimeter gap. So you've got to think
That's a fairly
how,
big gap.
well, it is a fairly big gap, absolutely.
And
And
is
so if
that
you
depending
think,
on, did you tell me, did you say what roof pitch that's for?
so that's for 10 degrees and less,
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
degrees or flatter,
So,
anything
so
between
yeah,
0 degree,
low
well, 1
pitch.
degree and 10 degree, correct, needs to have 25,000 lineal meter, 25,000 square meters per lineal meter, or equivalent to a 25 millimeter continuous gap on two long edges of the building. Now, the other thing that's a challenge here is once we have a 25 millimeter gap, there aren't many places on a building that have a 25 millimeter gap that don't have some form of mesh or covering or something to keep birds and dust and mice, etc., out. So automatically what happens, as soon as we have a 25 millimeter gap and then we need to put some mesh in there, the mesh, a lot of the bushfire meshes, for example, will have less than 50% open area of that mesh. So you get the sheet of metal and only half of that is actually holes. So
So
if
you've
you
got to
want to,
double it.
you got double it,
Yeah.
double, and sometimes more. It depends on the mesh, depends on, but let's take as a rule of thumb for barrel mesh, very roughly 50% is open area. So you've got to have a 50 millimeter continuous opening on two long sides of the building. And then we've got to think about things like weatherproofing. Then we've got to think about things like dust and leaves and crap getting in there that's going to clog it up, how it's going to look. And if we have a building that doesn't have any eaves or eave overhang, how are we going to actually fit that in there? So the design challenges around that, particularly in lower pitch roofs, are significant. Now, if we're going to a steeper pitch roof. Now, I'm putting my head on the chopping block here. I'm almost certain that if you've got a steeper pitch roof, like a 22-degree pitch, let's talk project estate home type thing, spec home, we only need to have a 7 millimeter gap. So what happens is when you have a steep pitch roof, like a 22-degree pitch truss roof, which is on many project spec homes, whatever you want to call them, the 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 inlet requirement at the eaves or the low level of the roof is 7,000 square meters per lineal meter, or an equivalent of a 7 millimeter gap, which is very easy to
Square
achieve.
millimeters or square meters?
7,000 square millimeters per
Millimeters.
lineal
Yeah.
meter, okay, which is equivalent to 7 centimeters by 10 centimeters for every lineal meter, which is equivalent to a continuous 7 millimeter gap. 7,000 square millimeters per lineal meter is equivalent to a continuous 7 millimeter gap. So that's 7 millimeter gap. That's pretty easy to achieve. That's less than a bed joint in a brick, 10 millimeters. That's less than a brick joint in a brick. Relatively easy to achieve. But if we go to a roof under 10 degrees, we're talking 25,000 lineal, 25,000 square millimeters per lineal meter, or a 25 millimeter continuous gap. So we're talking 3.5 times as much ventilation
So this
required for a flat pitch roof.
is 10 degrees the cutoff? So below 10 and above 10?
Yeah, there's an intermediate between 10 and 15, but
15.
let's just talk 15 and above and 10 and
Yep.
below. And
Yep.
it's
It's not
I'm
super
not going.
common to have a 12-degree pitch roof, is it?
Well, look,
Not super
well,
common.
I
Still.
suppose there's all sorts of weird stuff happening
Yeah.
out there, but there are a lot of roofs under 10 degrees. There's a lot of
Yeah.
roofs under 10
A lot.
degrees, and uh, and
And this is only in climate zone 6, 7, and 8.
this is in climate zone 6, 7, and 8. However,
So yeah, it's south of the
right,
country.
and interestingly,
However,
climate zone 8 is alpine zone, and as far as I'm aware, in alpine zone, the roof pitch generally has to be above X degrees to allow for snow load to fall off the roof. So in reality, and these are the interesting little nuances in the building code that you find out. Well, in climate zone 8, you more or less can't have a roof pitch under X degrees anyway because of snow load. So it's a bit of a moot point. But the interesting thing is, and there's no guarantee as far as I'm aware that National Construction Code 2025 is signed, sealed and delivered, but in National Construction Code 2025, as far as I'm aware, and I say as far as I'm aware, and I'm fairly certain, but not 100% certain, that this will extend to climate zones 4 and 5 as well. So more or less everything south of that, from the Queensland
the
border
bottom half of the
south,
country.
the
Yeah.
bottom half of the country, more or less, there's a few, but everything south of there will require those roof ventilation provisions. And there are
Except if
some
you're in South
changes.
Australia, because we've frozen our building code for a decade.
Yeah, well, and
Just a
look,
little caveat there.
no, and look, it's interesting, and in the industry, I get to meet a lot of very, very interesting people. And Tasmania was a bit of a standout the last few years, because the president of Master Builders Australia is from Tasmania. The CEO from Master Builders was from Tasmania. The chairman of the Australian Institute of Architects was from Tasmania, and the chairman of the Building Designers Association of Australia was from Tasmania, and three of those four I know to say hello to and chat to. So I get to meet a lot of very, very interesting people. And anyway, one of them, Craig Edmonds, who's the chairman of Master Builders Australia, we were having a conversation about this. And so what happened is the building ministers will sign off on whatever the draft provision is in the code. They'll say, we're going to sign off on energy efficiency, waterproofing, bushfire, whatever the case may be. And what's been happening recently on several of these, the building ministers will collectively sign off, because that's how the building code works. The building code has to have the agreement of the state ministers. And then before it comes out, they'll go, oh, actually, we're going to have a state variation on this. So we've signed up to have whatever these provisions are in the National Construction Code, but when it comes out, we're actually going to have an exemption or a variation in our state. So what you say about South Australia is, I think it was described to me as either a checkerboard or a patchwork or something to that effect. So, and I think this just reflects the complexity of construction regulation at the moment. It's phenomenal. And on that point, I was speaking to a lady just today, and she sent me the set of plans. She wants some stuff done on her house, nothing too unusual. And the house was built in 1968. Have a guess how many pages of plans there were for a 3-bedroom brick veneer house built in 1968?
One.
One page of plans. One.
Oh, wow. The
If
floor
you
plan,
had
that's it.
Well, it had 3 elevations, had a floor plan, had a footing plan, had a section through, and there was a lot on one page, but it was one page. And interestingly, it was all rendered in with beautiful colours, and it was a thing of beauty. But a thing of beauty
put that in a frame up on the wall.
No, it was a beautiful thing, and beautiful from a builder's point of view. You think, gee, I don't have to look at 27 pages to work out, what colour grout I'm going to use in every individual room. But these days, a basic house, I don't know what it is in South Australia. What is it in South Australia? A basic 3-bedroom, 170 square metre house. How many pages of plans would there be?
20.
Yep. Tasmania, 15 minimum, 15, 20. So, and I think that's just indicative of the complex. I think that's just a sort of an indicator of the complexity of construction. If we've got 15 pages of plans, well, there's probably going to be significantly more confusion, regulation, rules compared to one page of plans. And I think it's going to be a fascinating time in the next 10 to 15 years in Australia, as far as energy cost, as far as building regulation, as far as building cost, as far as people's perception of the home's value, all these things. I think there has to be a significant shift in our country as far as how we value these things, because historically it's been who's got the biggest house and how many cars in the garage, and from a cost point of view, but also an environmental point of view, that's not particularly sustainable.
Mm.
And how that's going to shift and change in the next 15 years is as anyone's guess, but it's all sort of up in the air to see how that lands.
Mm.
And the cost of construction, since pre-COVID, the last time I checked, it was something like 40% increase in construction since prior to COVID, and 60% increase in construction in the last 10 years. And then once we start putting in high performance buildings, we start putting in internal membranes, 8 stars, heat recovery, under slab, edge slab insulation, thermally broken windows, etc., etc., etc. Once we put that
Blower
in
door
there,
testing.
that blower door testing, yep,
Mm.
and not only that, there are lots of other certifications that need to go in now as far as waterproofing inspections, etc., etc. That 60% could very quickly become more than 60%,
Yeah.
and something's got to give. Something's got to give.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
hmm, hmm.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. This is definitely a topic that I hear a lot about, a lot of in this space. It comes down to cost. And
Yeah,
there's a long side, there's a long game here that we're playing, but you have to be able to afford the upfront cost in order to play the long game.
and part of that too is, and I was actually speaking to Dr. Dewsbury just this afternoon about, and the comment was something like people's ability to critically think, and
Mm.
look, we can have all these comments on society, etc., but are people watching Grand Designs on the Sunday night, or are they watching Married at First Sight on Sunday night?
I know what I'm watching, and it certainly isn't.
Well,
It certainly isn't
but
maths.
people can watch whatever they want. But anyway, it's just an interesting insight into society and how it works, and
Yeah.
what people's priorities are. Um,
Yeah.
that's who am I to judge what other people want? But how that pans out in the next 10 to 15 years, I think will be very, very interesting. And the whole
Yeah.
renewables thing, sustainability, building health, it's fascinating stuff.
Okay. So summarizing: roof ventilation, low pitch, ton of ventilation. There's a
Yep.
big gap you have to have in the low point and the high point of your roof. Higher pitch is much less, easier to it is
Yes.
designed for. Currently only in climate zones 6, 7, and 8, potentially moving up to climate zones 4 and 5. If you're listening and you don't know what they are, look up the BCA climate zone map and you'll see it's all color coded. You'll see exactly where all the climate zones are, and you can sort of get your head around what the areas of Australia that we are talking about right now. I'll link
Yep.
the
Yep.
map in the show notes as well.
No,
Um,
that's good. And look, I suppose another thing on that is that if you look back through history, is that steep pitch roofs have been the overwhelmingly most common construction type since the dawn of time. It's
mm. It's interesting though. I've just come back from Italy, and
yes,
all I saw everywhere was flat roofs. Everywhere.
yeah, right.
Was sitting in Positano in our beautiful
Occitano, yes,
breakfast
yes,
balcony. Oh,
yeah,
beautiful, beautiful place of the world. We're just sitting there, having our coffee and our pastries on this beautiful morning. And I'm looking out across the view, and I think I counted like 5 pitched roofs out of a sea of dwellings on the side of this hill. And I thought to myself, oh, does it not rain here? Like, I mean, the construction there is very different. It's all blockwork and concrete. And the roof structures I don't actually know what they make their roofs out of, but I imagine they're very different to the types of roofs we build now here in Australia. But I just couldn't quite understand why all of their roofs a flat. So I looked it up, and it was actually to do with space. So they use their roofs for growing vegetables, and it's an additional living space. So that was an interesting take on roof structure and reasons behind it.
It's time for a quick sponsor shout out. Today's episode of the Building Sciology Poddy is proudly brought to you by our amazing sponsors, Enduro Builders and Climasure. A huge thank you to these incredible businesses for supporting the podcast and helping us spread the word about better buildings to live and breathe in. Your support makes this podcast possible. Please head over to their websites and follow their
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether that's it's a masonry roof as opposed to a timber
Yeah,
framed
I think
roof.
so.
And
There was
yeah,
actually one that was being renovated. As we were driving past one day, I actually saw, I took a quick picture of it and I'll put it up on the screen, um, of a roof being renovated, and it had this black membrane over the top of it, which I can only imagine was one of those like tar waterproofing
yes,
type
yes.
membranes. I couldn't see what was under it, but I would imagine it wasn't timber.
Yeah,
I
and
don't know.
it would be interesting to know. And I suppose there are all these regional variations depending on climate, humidity, rainfall, etc., etc. But
Yeah.
and I
Oh, it's
suppose
cold. Mm.
yeah, well, a Mediterranean climate. I don't know where Positano is, but in theory should be
The Amalfi Coast. It was south,
right. Okay. Mm,
or middle of sort of middle of the
yep.
country, but it was cold. It was sort of like 12 degrees during the day, 15 down
Yeah.
to
Okay. Yep.
4 or 5 at
Yep.
night. Like it got
Mm,
cold at
mm,
night.
No,
Mm.
it would be interesting to know the local sort of dynamic of what's going on there. And look,
Yeah,
I'm saying that in the most general sense about steep pitch roofs over history, and sure there are the local variations and the vernacular interpretations of that, but
I
yeah,
was just so
um, mm,
surprised, and it wasn't just
mm,
there.
mm.
It was all through Rome and everything. Like everywhere was just flat. I was
Okay.
like, this is
Well,
why.
well, and look, I suppose that's part of the whole thing. Is there are all these little sometimes these differences are where you find out information that
Mm.
sort of pulls the whole story together or explains
Yeah,
why that happens. Okay,
yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. But I think what you're saying traditionally, particularly in Australia, flat
Mm.
roofs are definitely a new thing with the aesthetic, with the parapets, and not making the roof so you can't even see it, and no shading, and that's a very popular design along Australian coastlines.
No,
Um,
that's right, and they're called parapet, flat roofs, butterfly, whatever.
yeah.
And I was speaking to my son the other day, and he came up with this very interesting term, and he said, "Dad, I think that's a bucket roof." A bucket
Oh,
roof because all the outsides are
out of
high
the
up in the
the
middle
mouth of babes.
and was more than a babe. But I thought that was a very interesting way to describe a bucket roof. And when you think about it, roofs are designed to shed water to the outside. And when we see essentially this reverse thing happening where everything's got high perimeters around it, well, it looks like a
It's a
bucket,
bit of a
doesn't
bucket.
it? with a hole in the side.
Yeah.
So look, yeah, the flat roofs are disproportionate problems from all sorts of points of view, and even from the point of view putting penetration, putting skylights, flashing them, etc.,
Mm,
etc.
mm.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see how that pans out in the design space. And so anyway, long and short of is, Mark and I have come up with some after many sort of iterations, we've come up with some what we believe to be sensible solutions. But uh, the first point on that is it's not like we came up with those overnight. And secondly, they're all a considerable amount of mucking around to achieve them compared to business as usual. Um,
Mm.
and I think one of the big challenges here, and this is historically what has happened uh, for a number of reasons, is a building designer or an architect will say balustrade to NCC clause, whatever, waterproofing to Australian standard 3740, and they'll refer back to an Australian standard or a clause in the National Construction Code. Now, the thing here is if a building designer says build roof to NCC housing provisions 10.8.3, uh, that, and they haven't considered ventilation, haven't considered insulation clearance, haven't considered all these things, that could be the difference between another 150 millimetres in roof height. And if we're talking an inner
Mm,
city
mm,
development like inner city Melbourne, Sydney, where your height limits are absolutely critical, that can make a big difference. So the other thing with the roof ventilation provisions is there's a specific requirement for a roof space. And so historically, the depth of a roof assembly would have been dictated by the span of the rafter. So you might need an LVL that's 150 or 200 millimetres, whatever the case may be, to span distance, whatever. And so what the situation is now is that there's a minimum roof space required. And if you have insulation, so let's say we have R5 insulation with a nominal loft of, say, 210 millimetres, something around there, then what that means is that your roof assembly must be the insulation height plus 20 millimetres as a minimum. So rather than just relying on what your structural requirements are, it's dictated to at least some degree by insulation. Historically, no one really cares what the insulation loft is, just squeeze it in there. But now,
mm,
if insulation is lofting and closing that roof space, it is no
mm,
longer compliant. So, and that's
mm,
irrespective of whether it's a 30-degree pitch roof or a 5-degree pitch roof. So for the first time
mm,
in a roof, that the insulation is absolutely critical. Um,
mm,
and,
mm.
and box gutters are one of those, especially box gutters on flat roofs, are one of those things that are um, more prone to people just squeezing stuff in there and poor ventilation, and a lot of funky designs that are really pushing the envelope. Interestingly, we did a course in Canberra a few weeks ago, and while I was updating some of the notes, there was a thing I found on the just came up in my feed on the internet about a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Now, anyone who knows anything about Frank Lloyd Wright will know he's the most famous architect. Simon and Garfunkel actually did a song about Frank Lloyd Wright. How many architects had a song done about them? Anyway, there was a song about Frank Lloyd Wright by Simon and Garfunkel. And anyway, this his one of his most famous houses was one called Falling Water, which was built over a waterfall. And this house just the other week had an $11 million repair bill on it, and that's not the first time it's been repaired. And and in the blurb on this news feed was Frank Lloyd's writes aversion to flashings. Well, surprise, surprise. So one of the most famous houses in the world, $11 million,
Wow.
and the guy didn't like flashings. And I recall something along the lines of Frank Lloyd Wright is known as saying, if the roof doesn't leak, you haven't been innovative enough in your design. So so this is the bizarre.
It's counterintuitive.
But this is some of the weird stuff, and how many other architects are as well known as Frank Lloyd Wright? Um,
I'm gonna have to Google that, and if I find it, or when I find it, I'll link that in the show notes as well, because that's bonkers. That
yeah,
was one of the most sort of the first um sort of projects that I sort of in my studies became aware of. So that's yeah,
as would a lot of other
we're all
people.
taught about Frank Lloyd Wright.
But you didn't know about the Simon and Garfunkel song, did you?
I did it. We'll also link the song because I'm not going to go and find it.
You can link the song.
Yeah, great. Um, so yeah, you've been talking about. Oh, one more thing I wanted to ask you about roofs. Okay, and this is just for my own, but also for the listener. So the 20 mil gap above the insulation is written in ventilate depending on pitch. If you have a vapor permeable membrane,
Yes.
can you ventilate above that membrane instead of below it?
Yes, you can. You can. Now, this is and this is very interesting because in National Construction Code 2025, there's another big shift in that again. Okay, so if you're confused, don't worry because a lot of other people are confused.
That's why I'm asking. I'm asking
No,
the expert so we can
yeah,
all
yeah,
we
yeah,
can all know.
and look, when I did the article, I I know a lot of very smart people in the industry, and I want to make sure that if I'm doing an article, or Mark and I are doing an article, that we're reflecting what is representative of what the smart people in the industry or the relevant people feel or what their opinion is. And I sent this article out to many people, and only one person picked up a very significant error, which was Andy Russell from Procter, and which is fascinating because all these other experts in the industry did not pick up a significant error in the article. Okay, so
What was the error?
the error was it was an interpretation of it was basically an interpretation of the sort of what you're talking about. And look, to be honest, I can't remember exactly what it was. But the long and the short of it is, to say it's a significantly if people are confused, that's perfectly understandable. Now,
Yeah.
again, coming back to this idea of trying to make things easy for people to understand, Mark and I, we did an article on LinkedIn a few months ago. We're doing another article for the Design Matters National Online Magazine, which should be available online shortly, which goes into some of these things to help demystify it, because there's a huge amount of confusion around it. And I would be kidding you if I said I looked at it the first time and go, I get this straight away. I didn't, not at all. Um,
Mm.
and look, I think the other thing too that happens with any of this, let's talk about masonry and brick veneer. That's been around for 70, 80, however many years. Roof tiling, same. Wall framing, same. Footings, same. But things like even bushfire rating, that's been around 10, 15 years. So I've had a bit of time to get into it. Waterproofing, the same. But a lot of these provisions around condensation have only had a 3 to 5 year lead time. So unlike glazing provisions and snow loads and stairs and balustrades, et cetera, that we've had decades or longer to consider, that these are relatively new. And over time, people will get their head around them in the same way that people now go, oh, BAL 29, I know I need blah, 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 blah on a BAL 29, because I've had 10 years to get used to it. But when you start off with new regulations, and also new regulations that are still a moving target, it's completely understandable that people don't get it. Now, in many ways, the building surveyors, the gatekeepers, and a lot of building surveyors don't get it. But
I
who'd
don't
want to
get
be
it
a
either.
building surveyor? How many Australian standards does a building surveyor need to know? So
They need
ask
to
the
know
question,
all of them, and they just can't.
and who'd want to be a building surveyor? It's
I know. Hats off to them, honestly.
it's a tough gig. It's a tough gig, and we have this phenomenally regulated industry, and these people are supposed to be the ones who are the catch-all that understand everything and should be able to pick everyone up on it. It's a tough game, and I think in Tasmania, what, the last time I don't know, $4,000-ish. Don't quote me on that for a new home. I mean, you don't get much for $4,000 in any other part of the industry, and this is what they're look. It might be more, but the amount of money they're expected that they're charging to do this amount of work it's
Mm,
nowhere near enough, in my opinion. Mm.
yeah, I
And the
agree with
risks
you.
associated with it are just huge. So look,
Yeah,
the roof ventilation is a complicated area. If people don't understand it, that's you're not alone. Mark and I are trying to get more resource out. But that being said, there's other companies out there that have good resources as well. But yeah,
so I will link your LinkedIn article in the show notes as well. And when your new article comes out, that may or may not be out. It should be out by the time this episode is released.
yes,
I'll link that one too, because I remember reading your LinkedIn article and getting a lot from it. So I think
well,
the listener will
that,
too.
that's good. That's good.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think uh, everyone can get something from it, whether you're fairly new to the industry or fairly experienced. I think that there's such a wealth of knowledge. If we work with each other, we can all sort of lift, and that lift each other, and that's great.
Yeah, totally. So
Hmm.
can you quickly, so you can ventilate above and not below. Does that depend on the pitch of the roof? Like if you've got a roof void, if you've got a 20-degree pitch and you've got a vapor permeable membrane and you've got your vented cavity above the membrane, you've got the 20 mil, you've got all your stuff. Do
Yes.
you still have to vent under the membrane as well? And
Yeah.
out,
No, you do not need to vent under the membrane. Now
but that's got to be a class 4 vapor permeable membrane, right? It can't be anything less.
uh, as far as I'm
I
aware,
think there was a cutoff.
as far as I'm aware, it's a class 4 vapor permeable
Yeah.
membrane. far as
Yeah.
I'm aware.
Okay.
Now, the other thing with this too is, and this is something we do a lot in the training, is this thing between mass transfer and diffusion. So water vapor going through a membrane is diffusion. Humid air being transported out by air movement is mass transfer. So mass transfer is hundreds or thousands of times more effective than
Yeah.
diffusion. So if at all possible,
Yeah. Yeah.
you want to,
Both.
and I'll
Mm.
put a caveat on that. If at all possible, and the design allows for it, and the energy
Mhm.
efficiency allows for it, and the system allows for it,
In
uh,
terms of the building system?
passive, as far as passive house does not allow you to ventilate under the membrane.
No.
But if the system allows for it, all things being equal, considering all the factors, ventilating is going to be more effective than diffusion.
Getting rid of moisture.
Correct, as far as getting rid of moisture is concerned, correct. And there's sort of nuances in the British standard as far as the long and the short of it is, if you have a a vapor permeable membrane, the amount of ventilation under the membrane is less. You've still got to ventilate, but it's less. But look, there are all these nuances, and so yes, you can have a vapor permeable membrane and have your roof space above that vapor permeable membrane. And look, I think part of what's happened here with NCC 2022 and more so with NCC 2025, there are people at the pointy end of the industry with passive house, for example, saying we want to do blah and blah and blah. We do not want to have to ventilate under our membrane because that completely upends the passive house system. So
Mm.
the code has to allow for these other forms of construction that aren't the sort of generic forms of construction.
Yeah. And I
And,
think this actually goes back to what the Joe Sebrick comment about don't ventilate your freaking roof. I think what he is talking about is not the standard Australian roof with a roof void. He's talking about a more high performance type roof.
yeah, and this is where all these nuances and details come in,
Yeah.
and a thing we're very big on in training is whatever you do, don't say, oh, this is what they do in America or Canada or
Mm.
Europe, without making sure you have the whole system, because you can
Yeah. There's
take,
a context that goes with.
yeah, that's right, and you can take part of a system and apply part of the system without understanding. And a very significant one is, okay, in the US, they're oversheeting all their buildings. So what they're doing, well, not all their buildings, but it's very common to have an OSB-oriented strand board that looks more or less like plywood over the top of everything, and then put a membrane on the top, and then put their
Mm.
shingles. And this is what they do
Mm.
in America. But is
Yeah.
the OSB or plywood or the material they're using in America, the same as the one we go and get from the local hardware shop? And I
I
call,
don't think it is. I got told it's
well,
not the
this,
same. It's got
well,
different glues and stuff.
completely, and I call it the
Yeah.
orangutan hardwood. It's probably straight out of the Malaysian rainforest with a few bits of orangutan fur in it. And yeah, you've got to be politically incorrect. But the reality is it's all very well to think we're doing the same thing, but it only takes one small thing to be different, and the whole system can fall down. And
Mm.
I was mentioning to you before, there was some, and I can't say too much about it because it was a catastrophic failure where someone thought, I will do this and use a local product. The product didn't suit. The building surveyor started asking a few questions. The client started asking a few questions, and $600,000 worth of building was demolished and the builder went bankrupt. And this was a thing that, had they asked the right question at the right time, that could have all been avoided. And this seems okay, but it wasn't okay. And $600,000 later, the builder's bust. The place has been demolished, and for a few simple questions, this could have been avoided. Um,
Wow.
and and and
Yeah.
and look, it's no different to saying, I've got a Toyota such and such, I'm going to put a Nissan fan belt on it. Well, it might look the same, but when it all blows up, who's going to warrant the car? And it's the same thing, whether it's waterproofing membranes, whether it's any other complex system. We have to make sure we're following that system.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think that then that sort of getting some context around Joe's comment is important, because if you just apply that "don't vent your freaking roof" to your standard Australian roof, you could end up with some problems. And the reason behind what he said was to stop roofs blowing off during cyclones and to stop fires from starting in roof spaces. And it's the right advice, but it needs a broader context around it to make sure that it's a healthy roof.
That's right, and look, every area has its own sort of differences that need to be factored in, and whether that's a masonry-based roof in Italy that happens to have the correct waterproofing compound on it, or whether that happens to be a passive house roof assembly that you do not want to ventilate under the membrane.
Yeah.
One difference can make a big difference. And
Yeah.
there was a very interesting study many years ago, and it was in the Pacific Northwest of Canada, and a journal article, a scientific journal article, and the long and the short of it is that it said that the simplest way to minimise condensation in a roof is to have more heat flow into the roof, and have more heat flow into the roof means take out the insulation, because what was happening is that they were finding that the external humidity in the natural environment was so high and the roofs were naturally so cold because of the amount of insulation in the roof, that it was very, very hard to stop high humidity in the roof, because there was high humidity outside and cold roof assemblies. So Vili Ordonov from ProClimate had some interesting posts on LinkedIn last summer, I believe, or maybe the summer before, about Sydney, and when it was El Nino or La Nina, whichever one it is, creates the high humidity in Sydney, that even if we ventilate buildings as well as we possibly can in Sydney in the middle of summer, when you've got a dew point of whatever, 18, 19 degrees, that it is virtually impossible to have healthy humidity inside a building unless you are specifically having dehumidification in the building. And and again, as we move to more high performance buildings, and as we move to more moisture sensitive materials, that problem becomes worse and worse. So historically, when we had durable materials, sawn timbers, hardwoods, didn't have paper face plasterboard, didn't have MDF skirtings, etc., that might not have been so much of a problem. But as we're moving towards these more moisture sensitive materials, etc., those are variations in humidity can make a significant difference. And how that then sort of marries in with human health is another question altogether.
Yeah. Could you go back and give us some examples of some of the disaster sort of, well, the experiments gone wrong that you've seen? Because we were chatting earlier, and you were telling me about a couple, and there was one about a roof, and so I'm keen to flesh that out a bit.
Yeah. So look, that one was a 1930s traditional hardwood frame, steep pitched roof, big gable ends with weatherboards on them, and that had been wrapped up tight as a drum with blue and silver sarking, then had the full length ColourBond sheets put over the top, which is standard practice. And people say, what's the difference between a full length ColourBond sheet? Well, what happened with the old sheets? They were typically 8 foot, 2.4 meters long. They'd span over a few battens. And so they naturally had lots and lots of little gaps everywhere. And when we're talking about a steep pitch roof, and it's saying you need an equivalent of a 7 millimeter gap, continuous gap, if you've got 2.4 meter sheets everywhere, lapping over each other, you're naturally going to get these 7 millimeter gaps everywhere. But as soon as you put full lengths of ColourBond that are 6 meters long with perfect laps on them, that 7 millimeter gap is soon non-existent. So just by changing the method we're wrapping them up, that ventilation disappears. Anyway, this roof, I've got some sensors in that roof, and it is in winter, 3 or 4 days of the week in winter, it will be into 100% humidity. And the 100% humidity is typically from 9 till 12 in the morning, which is interesting. It's not actually at 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, which is the coldest part of the day. It's actually a few hours after the coldest part of the day. And the humidity and the moisture in those battens is 35% moisture content in those battens. And I'm actually working on that house at the moment, getting some ventilation in there. So here's an example of we can have and apparently is the word innocuous or innocent or well-intentioned upgrade, which is extremely common throughout Australia. And here's a building that's been functioning perfectly fine for the last 90 odd years, and all of a sudden we create a situation where we're getting extremely unhealthy conditions in that roof space because of one simple action. The flip side of that too is that if that had been a radiata pine frame instead of a hardwood frame, it would be absolutely caked in mould within a few years. And but again, this is part of the beauty of what I get to see is these experiments. Now we get to say, okay, we're going to flip the experiment and see how we can rectify that and what factors we need to incorporate in to rectify. And that's a really interesting thing. Another one, and it's interesting. It's a bit like I don't want to say the wrong thing, but a bit like The Odd Couple. Mark's the mad sort of or the eccentric academic, and I'm the scruffy builder, and between us we find out all sorts of interesting stuff, and there are several of these things. I found these things in houses. Mark's came out, and then at the next, scientific conference, Mark has said, "This is what we found in houses in Launceston," and this other one is absolutely fascinating, and we've seen it multiple times where passive solar design would say you have your bathrooms and your wet areas and your laundries on the south side of the building. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, what's happening on the south side of the building?
I know what you're going
Getting
to say. It's
less
cold.
less direct ventilation, high thermal mass, poor airflow. They're not opening the windows, naturally
My
colder.
goodness, of course.
And we've seen these buildings where all the joists on the north side of the building are as good as the day they went in. But on the last 2 metres underneath the bathrooms, wet areas, kitchen on the south side, you can
Yeah.
pull them apart with your hands.
Yeah.
And this is good passive solar design or energy efficient design, or whatever you want to call it. But the hygrothermal flow on effect can be catastrophic. And we've seen houses less than 20 years old where half the joists, most of the joists on the southern side are just like styrene foam, can be pulled apart with your hands. And these were built to code.
Yeah.
17 years. And it's not uncommon. And
that's not even that long ago. 17 years ago, it was 2007. That's how old my daughter is. Like, it's not even that long ago.
Yep. Built this century and built to code. And by that time, the building codes had that they were robust. They were representative of how we should build good houses. Not like this is 1950s technology, but again, a lot of these floor systems are either radiata pine or engineered timber. Had they been a sawn hardwood, that 20 years could very easily be 50 years till failure, whereas now it's 20 years. And so, again, we think, oh, we're using timber under the floor, but not all timber is the same. And these are the things. It only takes a few little changes that might appear insignificant, and they all add up.
It changes the heat, air, and moisture where it all grows.
That's exactly right, and the durability and the drying, and it's another thing Joe Steinbeck was saying in the podcast a few weeks ago, and you must have some what's the word, negotiating power to get Joe to come to your things, Jess. Good for you.
I was pretty happy with myself with that one.
Yeah, no, good luck to you. That's great. And the ability to dry paired up with the durability is a really important factor.
Yeah.
And look, and we're seeing all these weird and wonderful things all the time. And one just a few weeks ago, a 13-year-old build where all the cladding had to come off, the flashings hadn't been put in correctly, that had not been installed correctly, and 13 years old and all the cladding's completely rotted. There's rot around all the timber framing, and a whole lot of remedial work had to be done just because the flashings weren't done correctly. And so whether it's a modern house or a 60-year-old, 100-year-old house, we're seeing these things all the time. It's really interesting. And then to be able to tie that in with Mark's research that he's doing with people like Hartwig Kunzel from Fraunhofer, it's a fascinating mix to be able to pull the practical everyday to the scientific research and blend it all in. It's good stuff.
I think that's what you and Mark did beautifully. It's a beautiful pairing, beautiful relationship you've got going.
Or maybe The Odd Couple, which is Yeah.
I have a couple of questions that I don't want to let leave my mind. So one is about the sensors that you've been installing in roof spaces,
Yes.
and the other one has left my mind. No, the other one is, let's just go with the roof sensors. The other one
Yeah.
might come back to me.
So look. Now I've done the woofie training. I think you and I first did our first woofie training several years ago at the same time. And anyway, for one reason or another, I haven't followed specifically down that woofie path. But the thing is, when we do a hygrothermal modelling, there's a lot of questions which are a lot of parameters which you cannot answer 100%. So let's say we have a design and we say, okay, we're 90% sure it's going to be in this range and whatever, with all these parameters, but we can never be 100% sure. And we do, it's fascinating. We do this training and builders will come to me, but they never come to me or Mark with the easy questions. They always come to us with these outrageously complicated questions. They're like, oh man. I mean, you're asking me the 0.1% question, not the 10% question. We can answer the 10% question anyway. And so what we've come up with, which is I think is really fascinating, is a simple solution is, and there are several builders doing this. Sean Buchanan's doing it. There are several other builders I know who are doing it, and they say
Who's
we've got it.
actually a guest coming up, by the way, Sean Buchanan.
No,
I've got him lined up.
and I'll tell you a story about
He's
Sean.
amazing.
I'll tell you a story about Sean in a minute. But anyway, it's a great story. But what's happening is we're putting these. We say if you're not sure, put some of these sensors in the roof. They cost $200-300 each. They'll send out a signal every 15 minutes to your phone or your computer. You can monitor them remotely. They have a several-year battery life. And so from what's happening is we say, we're not sure how this is going to work. We're fairly certain it's going to work. We're not absolutely 100% sure. So put a few of these sensors in your roof. Monitor them for the first couple of years, see what
And it's
happens.
relative humidity and temperature.
Correct. And you
Yep.
can get sensors that will do all sorts of weird and wonderful things.
Yep.
But relative humidity and temperature, and
They're the two key ones.
they're the two counts. And this is what hygrothermal is. This is what woofie is. Temperature and
Whatever
humidity.
it is.
Temperature and humidity. Temperature and,
Yes.
and that's what woofie does. Temperature, moisture. Temperature, everything's about those two. And from that everything else flows. And and so put these in your roof. And if you're going through your first winter and you're never getting above the mid-70s of humidity, or it might just be creeping in there for a short period, happy days. And so what that does, it gives you peace of mind, it gives your client that quality control, and you know how your building's working. If you go through the first winter and you're getting 85-90% humidity regularly in your roof, you say, okay, we know there's a problem. We can go back and address that in the first year. Rather than there being a problem
Makes sense.
5 or 6 or 12 years down the track, you say, okay, we know there's a problem. We can address that problem. We can actually leave the sensor in the roof and check that is actually that humidity has been dealt with by our remedial action. And look, $200-300 a sensor, you get an electrician to put a PowerPoint in, it's $300. That's and it was only 5 or 8 years ago. If you had to do that, you had to go there, take off roof sheets, put in a moisture meter, put the roof sheets back on, get a harness, get a ladder, blah blah blah, and go and do it multiple times in the winter. Whereas now it can all be done on your phone remotely. And as far as knowing how your building works, quality control, assurance for the client, knowledge of what you're doing, it's amazing. And there's one I'm working on at the moment. It's a church with I do a lot of work on religious buildings one way or another, and not just churches. I've done some on mosque as well. Anyway, so they've got this problem with subfloor ventilation, and they've said to me, the engineer said, the subfloor ventilation is fine. I said, you are not getting below 80% humidity ever in summer in your subfloor under that church. There is absolutely not enough subfloor ventilation. The engineer said there is. So, well, is the engineer a hygrothermal specialist? And again, you can have these arguments till the cows come home, or you can say, here we have the data. We know that in summer, the humidity under the floor is never getting below 80%. The problem has not been solved. Do we need to spend more money? Yes. Why do we need to spend more money? Because this is the information we're getting. And that's the cost benefit on that is just phenomenal.
Absolutely.
And I've got 10 of them in floors and roofs and walls all around Launceston, and I've even got some in my own house with as a point of reference thing, because we can have all these hydrothermal models, but do we know what the typical moisture profile in the humidity profile in a pitched roof in Launceston or in Adelaide or in Sydney is? We don't. We don't have that data. So even having that as a benchmark that we can say, okay, well, I know that in my old roof, which is ventilated like nothing else, that I can see what the typical humidity profile is in that over the season and compare that to other buildings. Is it above or below? And we've got a benchmark. And for a few $100s a year, it's nothing.
No
Um,
brainer. And I think the performance of the roof, I mean, people like you and I and, builders and anyone who's entrenched in this stuff every day knows how important the roof is to performance.
entrenched in this stuff,
Yeah.
immersed or entrenched.
Uh, don't they mean the
So,
same thing?
no, anyway, it's all good. Yep, yep.
I don't know. Now I'm going to have to go and look it up to make sure I'm
No,
saying the right thing. But
yeah,
you know
no,
what I
it's all
mean.
good.
So we're
Yes,
all in
yes,
this. We're up to the eyeballs in this stuff every day.
yes, yes.
And we understand that the roof matters, but I think for your general, person just living in a house, they don't think about roof performance. So it's up to us to, like the roof is facing the sky. It's where all the sun goes, all the water goes. It's up there. It's protecting us from all of the elements, and monitoring the performance of that roof is actually something that it's fairly important, but we don't do it.
And look, I think whether it's the roof, and another one of my pet things is subfloor ventilation, because the number of problems I've seen in buildings just because of either poor subfloor ventilation and or poor drainage under the subfloor is phenomenal. And in Tasmania, there are a lot of old buildings with bearer and joist suspended subfloors, and I believe we've still got a lot of them compared to the mainland. I've seen multiple situations where poor subfloor ventilation and poor or high levels of moisture in the subfloor has been the cause of condensation or mold or moisture problems in other parts of the building, including the roof.
Is that because the moisture travels up through the walls, like in a brick veneer
Oh,
house,
all of it can travel through multiple paths, including through the walls, including
or
if you've got
through
an
the
old house.
conditioned space?
Yeah, correct. Through all the gaps, and
Wow.
obviously where the yellow tongue floor, which is technically a vapor barrier, is going to go more around the wall path and through a tongue and groove type floor. But there was a house I looked at in southern Tasmania. Can't say too much about it. It was all a big legal stoush, legal problem, and everything had been built to code, and the people had to that they were sleeping in the lounge room for 2 years because the bedrooms were uninhabitable. The how the amount of mold in the roof was just off the dial,
Mm,
and it would appear that the main contributing factor to that was poor subfloor ventilation.
wow.
So this is the thing that we can have, and it sounds completely counterintuitive, but we've seen it multiple times, is where we've seen it a few times where a problem in the roof actually originates through poor subfloor ventilation. And look, this is the sort of thing Mark and I come up with all the time, all this weird and wonderful stuff. So what I've got now, I've got a hand auger, which is this beautiful thing. So when you get into this sort of stuff, you get excited about things like hand augers. It's made by an Australian company called Dormer. They're not cheap, but they're a thing of great beauty. Anyway, we auger these holes down, 65 mil auger, put a 50 millimeter PVC pipe in that hole with a whole lot of drill holes in that pipe, put a plastic cap on that, and then you can actually see how deep the water table is under the ground. So you can actually basically look into the ground, see what's happening at the water table. And we've done this several times where people say, where do we need an ag drain? How deep does the ag drain need to be? Have we got a moisture problem? Well, we put these holes in the ground everywhere. You go and stick a broomstick down in the middle of winter, go and stick a broomstick down in the middle of summer, see where your water table is, see what your problem is. So instead
Wow.
of having to guess what the problem is, you can see it's like X-ray vision into the soil. And these are the weird and wonderful things that we come up with. But the practicality of the solution is just it's amazing.
It's so
And
simple.
and simple, beautiful and simple. And Tim Law and I worked another semi-destructive way up to look at deterioration of timber floor framing through with a torque wrench and some screws, which was a brilliant way to work it out. And we're developing this stuff all the time. Coming back, this is a nice segue into the thing about Sean Buchanan, is that Sean attended some of this training that Mark and I did. He was one of the first people when he was working for Zanetto Homes. And I can actually remember they were sort of up the back yabbering, shut up. And I think what it was that they were just so interested. They were having this conversation because they were so interested, and I thought, shut up. But anyway, long and the short of it is, here, and Sean's a great bloke, but here it is 3 or 4 years later, and the conversations I have with Sean about air tightness, about blower door testing, about humidity, about vapor control, about air leakage around windows, about window seals, about the vapor resistance of yellow tongue flooring, blah, 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 is this is not someone who's just gone and listened to me and repeated what I've said. It is someone who's gone many levels above with his own motivation to find this stuff out. And this is what I find fascinating about builders. I've been to university. I've got an honours degree. I know a lot of people with PhDs who are very, very smart people, but there are a lot of builders out there who've never been anywhere near a university, but the level of knowledge and skill and aptitude and problem solving and intelligence and practicality and ability to put that all together, it makes my head spin. And someone like Sean, I look at what
100%.
he's doing, and here he
He's
was.
next level.
He's absolute, and there are several of them. And I say that these guys they're just smashing it, and the level of knowledge they're bringing to the industry and bring to their clients, and sharing that knowledge is on par with anybody who's got a PhD in, I don't care what topic. It is amazing. And I think this whole thing with, historically in the building industry, I build architectural houses. That's nice. I mean, that's wonderful. But now people can say, I'm doing something special in the building industry, but there's actually some measurable performance or measurable knowledge that goes with that, rather than just having a big fancy ute with your name on the side saying you do architectural homes. There's a real metric to say, this is what I'm doing. You can put information, measurable performance with your building that actually says, I don't just think I'm building better. I know I'm building better, and this is why I'm building better. And here's all the information that goes
Here's the
with it.
proof.
And this isn't just because I'm beating my chest with the big fancy truck with my name on the side. It's a provable, measurable thing. And to see how that's evolved. And look, Mark Dewsbury in many ways started this. He's been doing this for 15 years. He started the snowball 15 years ago. I happened to get in the snowball sort of 5, 7, 10 years ago, and I got caught up. And then other people like Sean and Kyle Zanetto, Luke Davies and Tim Hawkins have got caught up in the snowball, and the snowball's just getting bigger, and it's a pretty exciting snowball to be part of.
Yeah, absolutely. This is I keep sort of saying none of this stuff is taught in architecture school. Although having said that, I have had some South Australian universities reach out several times just this year. So they're upping their game as we speak. We're doing presentations and interviews and all that sort of thing right now, which is so good to see.
Yeah.
Because up until now, I haven't heard one architect say they learned anything about any of this during their studies. Same with carpentry apprentices or any of the trades. They don't learn about any of this stuff in trade school. So it's all a self-driven, self-motivated journey to understand all of this stuff. And guys like all those people that you mentioned, plus many more, the builder I work for, Jackson Digney from Enduro, it's all self-learned, self-taught, self-funded, self-everything. And so a builder is not the same, this builder is not the same as that builder. This architect is not the same as that architect. So when you go to engage a builder or you go to engage an architect, it's really, really well worth doing some homework on their background and their understanding of building science principles, because you'll get a very different outcome. Would you agree?
Oh, no, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And look, the dumbing, I shouldn't say dumbing down, but I suppose you'd call it the streamlining or rationalisation of the industry at all levels in the last 15, 20 years is significant. And look, I see this whole building, I'll call it building performance, building science, building technology, or whatever you want to call it, it's been a way for a lot of people to sort of re-engage with with the profession and skill of the trade rather than we're just putting bits of nails into wood. But the fascinating thing that's happened in Tasmania, and I don't know whether it's just a Tasmanian thing, but and we had Zara Dakota down here 12, 18 months ago, and she said the thing that blew her away most about Tasmania is that all these people that I've mentioned, and what I'm not trying to do, I'm not trying to name drop here. It's not about name dropping. It's about giving credit to people who've been the front runners, who've been the pushing the envelope. It's to give credit to those people where it's due, because there are a lot of us who've been involved in it. But the thing is, 9 times out of 10, people will say, here's what I've done, here's how I've solved the problem. Hey, let's sort of compare notes to see how we can do this better, rather than this is my turf, rack off, I'm not going to help you. And apparently in other jurisdictions, the rack off, it's my turf mentality is dominant, whereas in Tasmania it seems to be quite the opposite. And
Yeah.
and the other side of that for me, and I actually bumped into them today, Nathan and Lockie from Modern Homes in Launceston, and the stuff they're doing is phenomenal as well. And I can have a conversation with them. They'll invite me onto their jobs, show me what they're doing, show me how they're solving a problem. We have that conversation, and people just share that information, and it's absolutely amazing. And to see everybody just want to work with each other and improve that is pretty special stuff.
Yeah, I think it's quite common in just this better performance, better buildings industry. Like it's the same. It's the same here in South Australia. You know, the builder I work for, Jackson, will willingly go on to anyone else's building site and share what he knows to to help them bring the performance of their home up. In Victoria, it's the same. There's a lot of information sharing there between the builders in this game. I think it's really great to see everyone working together because we've all got a similar mission. That's
No,
another thing that I really love about our part of the world.
and look, it's coming back, sort of going back a few steps and then sideways a little bit. Is there was a webinar, and it was one that Tim Law was on. For people who don't know Tim Law, get online, look at some of his stuff, because he's an incredibly sharp, one of the sharpest minds I've ever met. And he was on a panel, and it was a health focused panel rather than a building focused panel, and these researchers in the public health area were saying that one of the best ways we can improve public health outcomes is building better buildings, and we're talking the tunes of
Absolutely.
tens of billions of dollars.
The potential is endless. And not just physical health, mental health. That family you talked about with the $600,000 building that they had to demolish, not just the mental health strain on the builder and on the family. When you told me about that, I just couldn't, that was what immediately came to mind. It's not just physical health because of moisture issues. It's
totally
the mental health strain.
No, that's right. And when you see people with 3 children all sleeping on the couch in the living room because they can't sleep in their bedrooms, that's marriage. That's marriage breaker stuff.
Absolutely.
Or worse.
Absolutely.
And look, whether it's the mold and condensation, or failing bathrooms, or and I've been in these situations before where people have bought a new house and 5 years later they can't use any of their bathrooms. It's the interesting thing is mold, condensation, waterproofing, water ingress, etc. That they're all just sort of different facets of the same fundamental problem. And another interesting thing is this whole thing about the decks over habitable rooms. Now, coming back to this roof ventilation, is that we've got there's 3 exemptions for the roof ventilation: structural insulated panels, concrete roofs, and roofs in a BAL FZ zone. Okay, now the BAL FZ zone, that's in the too hard basket, but that's a whole other thing. But
that's a whole other kettle of fish.
That's a disaster. But the other thing that looks like a roof and walks like a roof and quacks like a roof and flies like a roof is a tile deck over a habitable room. It's doing everything a roof is doing, but there is no requirement for ventilation under a deck over a habitable room, even though it's doing everything. If you had corrugated iron on top of that, instead of tiles, you would have to have structured ventilation. But as soon as you put tiles on that over a habitable room, you don't need to ventilate it. So why is that not a roof? And what are the hygrothermal problems around tile decks over habitable rooms? My recollection is Jesse Clark online once said, if I had to design something for condensation and mold failure, this is the best thing I could possibly design. And there's
There you go.
there's nothing stopping people doing them. However, more and more designers are saying we're just not doing them, or we've got to find some alternative solution because they're significantly problematic.
And there you go. I just learned something. It's not something I'd ever thought of or anyone has ever asked me about.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep.
Wow.
And it's doing everything a roof is doing. If that had tin over it, it would have to have structured ventilation. Put tiles over it. Oh, we don't need to ventilate it.
Yeah.
But it's doing everything a roof will be doing.
I guess the people, it just comes back to the people writing the building code are just people. There's no
Yeah.
overlord that says that they're going to get everything right. And we all know that there are things that need to be done over and above the building code to make it healthy. And that's just another example to make any structure healthy. And that's just one more very good example.
Yeah. What I'll do, I'm just at my desk. Just bear with me.
Mhm.
I'm a bit old school, and I've got a copy of the National Construction Code when it was printed, still printed from 2016. And in the front of the building code, it says that the long and the short of it is that the Commonwealth Government does not accept any liability whatsoever regarding damage, injury, blah, 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 from using what's in this publication. Okay. And this is the 2016 National Construction Code. This is
This is your typical legal disclaimer. This is the rules, but we don't want to hear about it.
and this is page number 3. This is page number 3. No liability for using or relying upon any information in this publication to the maximum extent permitted by law. That's on page 2 of the National Construction Code. And so it's so what that means, and I apologise for the disruption of getting the book down off the shelf, but what it means is that you can follow every single thing in the National Construction Code, and if your house falls down and everybody in it is, ends in
Perishes.
tears, there is nothing, no comeback you have on the government at all. Okay, but this is the interesting thing. This is 20, 30, 50 years ago, we had a brick veneer house looked like this, a truss roof looked like this, double brick looked like this, lightweight clad with weatherboards looked like this. But in the last 20 years, the explosion of materials with double glazed thermally broken windows, tiles over habitable rooms, swimming pools, and foam cladding, and on and on and on. So there's no longer these sort of 4 vernacular methodologies of constructions. There's an infinite number. So we have this plethora of construction types, methodologies, materials, assemblies that the National Construction Code simply cannot cover. There's just no way it can cover the multitude of permutations, combinations, assemblies, etc. And so more than ever, we have to say it is the bare minimum. And as we're getting more and more funky designs and different materials, and if you went back to the 1970s and told builders then we're going to be putting styrene foam on the outside of our buildings, they would have laughed at you. If you said we're going to be using MDF skirting, they would have laughed at you. But that has just become accepted now. If you said we're going to be building bucket roofs, they would have laughed at you. But this is happening everywhere. And so I think as building professionals, it's either a case of stick to the vernacular, stick to the 22-degree pitch slab on ground with a nice big eave overhang, or anything else has significantly more risk attached to it. unless you go with a dedicated specific system which covers all those ins and outs of it.
Mm.
And the more funky we get, the more the risk is of that happening.
And it's just another reason to, ask someone like yourself early on. If you're going to change up the status quo, then get good advice right from the start from people who understand heat,
That's
air, and
right. And
moisture.
look, the further you go from those vernacular sorts of construction, drive through a suburb that was built in the 1970s and look at what 8 out of 10 houses were built like. That's the vernacular construction. The further you depart from that, the more you need to get good information and understand the risks associated with it. And you said speak to people like me. And the other thing is, I know a lot about certain things, but I'm not for one second going to pretend I know all the ins and outs of everything. And this is the complexity of the industry now, is that whereas 20 years ago, 30 whatever years ago, that there was a go-to person about most things, but it is so complex now, the number of Australian standards, the changes, the codes, the materials, the regulations, the local government, the planning, the bushfire, for one person to be on top of every single aspect of that, it's I don't believe it's possible. I just don't believe it is.
Yeah. Well, all we can do is our best and collaborate together. Because I mean, one person might not know it all, but if you head together, you can cover off a few more bases.
Oh, for sure.
So
And look, I think
collaboration is key.
no, that's right. And I think things like this podcast, and like just last week, there's a roofer in Melbourne, Matt someone, and I think it's Matthew Carland in
Matt Calland.
at
Yep.
Carland in Victoria, and yeah, instead of going home and watching Married at First Sight, go and look at some of these videos, because the stuff I was learning about
Yeah.
roofing from this guy, it's phenomenal stuff, and
Yeah.
and I
He's up
suppose
there with Sean.
that's right. And look, I spoke to him a
Mm.
few weeks ago. He called me up about a few bits and pieces, and I think that's the flip side. As things are evolving, we've got this technology and information out there, provided you're getting it from not just some bloke who came down in the last shower. That the amount of information that's available out there from reputable people is significant, and it's good info.
And if you
And
don't know the answer, the way we all collaborate, you can send your person off to someone else who might know the answer.
that's right.
There's
That's
a
right. And
network here that's really full of good information and very robust.
no, that's right. And using these online technologies, I think, can fill a phenomenal amount of the gaps in there. And I've seen some of these conversations on LinkedIn. I had a conversation some years ago where the mighty Joe Steinbrück came in and had his two bobs worth, and someone said, Joe Steinbrück has told you, Clarence. I think, well, if I'm going to be told, I'll happily be told by him, and that's all good. Happy days.
Yep. Yep.
And that's a community that's developed. And that's the thing. Even people like Joe, who are the godfather of building sites, will come and jump into a conversation in Australia about something. I think that says a lot about how that community can operate at that level, which is
Mm.
pretty special.
Mm. Mm.
Hmm.
Mm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. We've got a couple more questions. I mean,
Yeah.
geez, couple. I've got dozens, but let's finish off with two. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for improvement for moisture management and or roof ventilation in Australia?
Where do I see the biggest opportunity for? I would say, in many ways, that the best answers are right under our noses. And if we go back through a suburb that was built in the earlier you go back, and I drive around Launceston, you see roof vents everywhere. You see eave overhangs everywhere. You see eave gutters, etc., everywhere. So I think a lot of it is in the basics, and I think the biggest opportunities are going back to the basics and realizing that the further we stray from those, the bigger the risks are. And ev- everything is possible if you're willing to do the cost, the technical, the knowledge, all the stuff that goes with it. But the further you go, the more you've got to get everything absolutely spot on, because there's less redundancy in the system. So I think going back to basics is really important. But and that sounds a bit trite to say that. However, I see really basic things being stuffed up all the time. All the time, whether it's timber durability, whether it's flashings, whether it's drainage, whether it's ventilation, whether it's door installation. There are so many of these basics, and I think getting those basics, whether you're building a house for the housing commission or whether you're building an architectural mansion, I think getting that fundamental basics is really important. And I think people often get sucked into this. Yeah, we've got the new tool and we've got the new truck and we've got the new whatever, and we've got the exciting uniform, but the basics will always be the basics no matter what you're building. And I think that for me is one of the takeaways. And whenever I have someone working for me, I don't care whether it's a roofer or a tiler or a plumber or whatever, I always try to share knowledge with them and get knowledge off them. And I think that's gold. So that's my answer to realise how important the basics are, because that's what it's been built on since the dawn of time.
Mm-hmm. And final question, what is the one thing you want everyone to know? If you had to give the entire building industry in Australia one piece of advice, I mean, we've covered back to basics, but if you had to give one piece of advice, what would it be?
The final question that I want everyone to know is don't underestimate the inner building scientist. And I know that sounds a bit corny, but the thing I've seen is if you have the knowledge and the interest and the skill, and you can network with other people and pull that information together, the amount of problems you can solve is phenomenal. And we're seeing it around us all the time. And I think as builders, and not just builders, building designers, anyone within that space, the amount of innate knowledge we have around what works and what doesn't work. And it's almost like a sixth sense. Once you've been in there long enough, you can look at something and say, no, it's going to work, it's not going to work. And I think the same thing comes with building science, building physics, building performance, that I believe a lot of people, if you're half motivated, there's a huge amount of passion and skill that you can harness together to solve a multitude of problems. And don't underestimate the skill that you have, and I've seen it happen multiple times. I was speaking to a guy just today, Daniel Isles up the northwest coast, and it's just a matter of skill, passion, interest, networking, communication, using your background to pull it all together, and the amount of things you can solve is really quite phenomenal.
That's bang on. I mean, that's how I have made my job, my career. I started out from very humble building design beginnings, and just my interest and passion brought me here.
Now,
one step at a time.
No, and look, it's and I've sort of, you and I've sort of crossed paths multiple times in the last few years, and it's interesting to see how people find that niche, and we all start. No one starts as an expert, but if me as the scientist is good at explaining things, you as a communicator is good at communicating things, and we all have a whole other bank of knowledge. We have that one thing we're special at, where we can deliver this, whether it's teaching, whether it's communicating, whether it's technical, whether it's supervision. A lot of people have that skill we can bring to it. And just another thing, for you doing this podcast, I take my hat off to you, and it's I think it's a wonderful thing. And I was not much of a podcast person until a few weeks ago. So I've actually listened to one. Matt Walsh. Who's the guy from
Ben Walsham.
Ben Walsham a few weeks ago. I was listening to that in the car, and I thought, there you go. This is my new driving tune is the podcast. So good on you,
That's
Jess.
great.
Yeah,
that's great. I love podcasts, and I listen to them all the time, not just work related, but all sorts of different things. I learn so much just while I'm driving to and from work.
better than Married at First Sight.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Clarence, for joining me today. I really appreciate all of your time and wisdom and experience, and I'm sure the listener does too. So thanks again.
No, thanks for having me, Jess. And look, I just encourage anybody out there to get into it, find the information, and use that to your advantage, because it's an exciting industry. It's a fascinating part of the industry, and there's so much we can all get from it for ourselves, for our clients, and it's who'd want to be doing something else, hey?
Yep, right on. All right, cool. Thanks, Clarence.
Thanks, Jess. Good day.
Okay, bye.
That is all for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. There'll be another episode in a fortnight, so if you would like to listen into the types of conversations that I have all the time, please subscribe on your chosen platform. Rate the show, leave a comment, whatever you like, share with your friends and family. I'd love for you to spread the word about the Building Sciology Potty. There's a link in the episode description where you can head to a landing page, and there are some show notes there with relevant links and a full transcript of the show as well, and also links to my socials. So if you're not already, I'd love for you to follow along there too, as I share lots of building science and building biology tips. There's also a contact page where you can send me an email or even a voice message. So if you've got questions or suggestions or guest ideas, I'd love to hear from you. I want to know what you want to know, so please get in touch with me. Thanks again. I'll be back in 2 weeks, so until then, happy healthy building.